Get out of the car right now, you piece of trash. You think driving a fancy car means you can do whatever you want. Officer Ryan Mercer shouted in the middle of the street, his voice cracking like a whip. Colonel Dana Cole stared straight ahead, unmoving. You just stopped a Pentagon Colonel. I'm about to make a call to a place you've never even dared to say out loud. The Pentagon, she said firmly. The phone answered, "Colonel Cole, we're on our way." And in an instant, Mercer's face turned as pale as ash. A man used to giving orders undone by 2 words: authority and dignity. When power is used to humiliate, justice steps in to teach the true meaning of the word respect. Have you ever witnessed something like this on the street? Leave a comment below. Washington, mornings were quiet, the wind carrying the scent of steel and concrete from a construction site a few blocks away. Colonel Dana Cole placed the file on the passenger seat. Inside it was the classified plan she had just presented at the Pentagon. Everything felt calm until the red and blue lights flickered in her rearview mirror. She glanced back, saw a police cruiser closing in, sirens tearing through the air. Pedestrians turned, some with curiosity, others with concern. Dana slowed down, pulled over, both hands steady on the wheel. Officer Ryan Mercer stepped out of the patrol car. Sunlight hid in his smug face. He didn't need a reason, just an opening. Each step he took toward her was a statement of power. He glanced at the license plate, let out a dry chuckle. Luxury car, black driver, probably bought it with welfare checks. The words floated out like breath, but they froze the air around them. Dinah stared straight ahead, lips pressed tight. She had trained in desert combat zones, heard live rounds scream past her ears, but that condescending voice chilled her deeper. Mercer slammed his hand on the hood and barked, "Get out of the car, now!" She rolled down the window, half her face catching the sun. "Do you have a valid reason for this?" Her voice was steady, clear, each word falling like metal. Mercer crossed his arms, sneered. "A reason I think you've already overstepped what's acceptable for your skin tone." Around them, a few people stopped, phones raised. What looked like a minor traffic stop was turning into a street performance of power. A middle-aged woman near the convenience store whispered to her friend, "What's he doing?" She didn't do anything, but Mercer heard, shot them a warning glare that made them step back. Dana took a deep breath, her chest rising into the sunlight. She opened the door and stepped out. Wind played through her hair, and the silver SUV gleamed behind her. Mercer moved in, voice rising. "I gave an order you didn't follow. Who do you think you are?" She answered slowly. "A law-abiding citizen." "Don't start with the morality act here," he shouted, his boots slamming the pavement. "I've seen your kind, so sure of yourselves, thinking that skin color is some kind of shield." A passerby shouted back, "What did he just say?" The murmur spread like wildfire. More phones kept recording, and Mercer tensed, veins bulging in his neck. She held her gaze unshaken. "Do you have documentation for this stop?" Mercer laughed. "Documentation? You want me to write down her skin was too polished to be trusted?" A wave of outrage rippled through the crowd, but no one dared step forward. She said quietly, "You're confessing your crime out loud." Mercer slammed the hood again. The metal rang out sharply. "My crime is trying to keep this country clean," he hissed. Dana looked deep into his eyes and saw the same blind hatred she had once faced on foreign battlefields, but this time it wore a uniform on her own soil. Her voice lowered, controlled. "I suggest you stop before this gets out of hand." Mercer stepped closer, breath heavy with the stench of cigarettes. "You threatening me? Who do you think you are? A lawyer? A protester?" She tilted her head. "A colonel in the United States military." He burst into laughter, throwing his head back, the sound echoing down the street. "A colonel? You think I'm that stupid? You think the military would hand that rank to someone like you?" A few people in the crowd gasped and a man shouted, This guy's lost it. Mercer spun around, yelling, "Who said that?" But no one answered. Donna stood still, her eyes locking onto the lens of a phone pointed at her. She knew the outside world was beginning to see. In that moment, she realized her silence was the most powerful evidence she could give. She reached for her phone hand, steady as if holding a weapon. "I'm calling your superior." Mercer smirked. "Go ahead. Let's see who even bothers to pick up." She enunciated each word clearly. "Pentagon." His laugh died halfway, the smile drained from his face. A brief pause followed, filled only with the sound of passing cars and the piss-pounding hearts of those watching. Mercer stammered, "Kiddin', right?" Dana held the phone to her ear. "This is Colonel Cole. I am being unlawfully detained, location South Arlington Road." Her voice was even firm, neither raised nor soft yet. It silenced the crowd. Mercer stepped back, trying to mask the panic. "Who are you calling your husband? Some friend of yours?" She looked him dead in the eyes. "Someone you've never held enough rank to speak to." In her ear, a familiar voice replied, "Colonel Cole. Confirm coordinates, response unit en route." Mercer turned pale, sweat beading on his forehead. One of the bystanders filming whispered, "Is she really a colonel?" The question spread quickly through the crowd. Dana lowered her phone gaze, calm like someone who had just ended a briefing. She said quietly, "You've crossed the line. Be ready to face the consequences." Mercer opened his mouth but found no words. From afar, the sound of military sirens began to rise steady and heavy like the heartbeat of someone about to be judged. The entire street fell silent, leaving only her standing tall. The SUV behind her, reflecting sunlight like a mirror, exposing the raw truth when power falls into the wrong hands. Justice always comes to take it back. The knock on the car window rang out in the morning air, heavy like a hammer strike. Officer Ryan Mercer knocked again, then barked, "Step out, hands on the hood. Make it fast." His voice was tight, laced with smoke and arrogance. Colonel Dana Cole remained seated, eyes straight ahead, lips pressed into a sharp line. "You're abusing your authority," she said each word, leaving her mouth cold as a blade. "I'm maintaining order," Mercer shouted, his throat strained, trying to turn volume into dominance. More people began to gather, some raising their phones, sunlight glinting off the lenses like wide-open eyes watching him. Dana opened the door in one swift motion, stepping out with her hands clearly visible. But Mercer wasn't interested in reason. He stepped back half a pace and shouted, "Black woman, resisting police." The words sliced the air, drawing startled looks. A voice in the crowd said plainly, "Did he really say that?" A young woman, recording eyes wide, whispered to her friend, "She's calm. How's that resisting?" The air thickened, tension spreading like smoke. Seeing those stares, Mercer shouted louder, as if noise alone could cover his slipping control. He stepped closer, finger jabbing near her face, rage and pride twisting in his stare. "You think I'm scared? This is Washington, not your damn base." Dana spoke slowly, her tone low but firm. "This is still the United States, and you represent the law." Mercer laughed dry and sharp, echoing across the intersection. "The law. I am the law here. If I say you're wrong, you're wrong. Got it." A child holding his mother's hand asked softly, "Mom, why is the policeman yelling like that?" The mother pulled the child away, not answering. Dana took a long breath, sunlight catching her face, making it shine in the crowd. "I'm asking you to remain professional." Mercer slapped the hood again, this time hard enough to dent the metal. "Professional, I'm doing my job. My job is to shut down people who think they're above the law." An older man nearby muttered, "Above the law or above you?" The comment reached a few ears, soft laughter rippled, and Mercer flushed red. He turned and yelled, "Shut the hell up," then back to Dana. "See what you did. Now I'm a damn joke," she replied, voice steady as ever. "You did that to yourself, officer." Her calm only pushed him further. "Don't lecture me, you piece of trash. You think that smile makes me back down?" He jabbed the air, his finger inches from her face. Dana didn't flinch. Her eyes cut through his fury, clear and cold as water. Someone recording leaned in and spoke near their phone. "He just called her trash. trash. Everyone heard that. The whisper floated through the crowd, and in that instant Mercer realized he had let those words escape into a world that was already watching. He rolled his eyes, trying to recover his authority, but his voice trembled slightly. "You think filming this will save you? People like you always play the victim," Dana replied. "I don't need a role, I need justice." Mercer squinted. "Justice? Don't kid yourself, that belongs to those who know how to bow their heads," she answered. "And you just proved why this country needs those who won't." The crowd went silent for a few seconds, then the murmurs returned. A teenager said to his friend, "She's not scared. Look at her." Mercer inhaled deeply as if to regain control. He growled, "I'll call for backup. We have the right to arrest you for your attitude." Donna tilted her head. "You can arrest me, but you can't stop the truth." Mercer froze his eyes, locking onto the lens of a phone streaming live. Behind him, the headlights of another patrol car flashed on, signaling another unit's arrival. People moved aside, their whispers fading, leaving only the two of them standing face to face. One cloaked in anger behind a uniform, the other calm, with the experience of someone who had commanded through war. The wind passed through, carrying the sound of flags flapping above the building across the street, and in that moment Mercer realized Dana's silence wasn't fear. It was the kind of silence that dismantled power piece by piece. Someone in the crowd whispered, "I think he's scared now." Mercer spun around, his gaze flickering. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. On the other side, Dana lifted her phone eyes on the screen, the bluish glow reflected in her sharp stare. "There's still time for you to stop, officer," she said, voice calm but loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. He didn't answer, his hand still clenched, knowing he had just lost the one thing he always believed untouchable, his ability to command without question. Mercer's anger rose with the confusion building inside him. He needed an action to regain control in front of the crowd. Holding up phones and arrogance led him to the worst choice. He reached over Dana's shoulder, yanked her handbag hard enough to snap the strap from its hook. The sound of metal hit the hood, followed by the clatter of scattered belongings. ID cards, pens, some documents, and a military badge rolled into the sunlight before stopping. The crowd went silent for a moment. Mercer bent down, picked up the badge, and turned it in his hand. "Fake," he sneered, contempt dripping from his voice. "You print this in some back alley market trash like you doesn't get issued a real badge." Dana stayed still, her calm gaze driving Mercer to the edge. "You just insulted a United States officer." Her words dropped softly but traveled far, startling a few in the crowd. Mercer laughed dry and defiant. "An officer? What is this, a movie? People like you just know how to play the victim." He hurled the badge onto the hood, the metal hitting with a sharp, cold clang. A man nearby shook his head. "This guy's unhinged." A young woman, filming, said under her breath, "She really is an officer." Mercer heard it snapped around. "Shut up. I'm performing my duty." The girl stepped back, gripping her phone tightly, eyes still fixed on Dana. Dana bent down and picked up the badge with a motion as gentle as lifting a sacred memory. She wiped the dust away with one finger, her voice low and firm. "I received this badge on the day I took my oath. Do you know what that means?" Mercer folded his arms, smirking. "It means you're a good liar," she replied. "It means I swore to defend this country, even from those who turned power into a weapon of humiliation." A few people in the crowd murmured in response. Mercer clenched his jaw veins, rising in his neck. "You're refusing a lawful search," he said, trying to regain the upper hand. "I'm telling you to stop violating federal law." "I am federal law here," Mercer screamed, and the volume of that outburst shattered what little logic remained. Wind swept down the street, lifting Donna's documents into the air. One photo of her rank landed at Mercer's feet. He bent down, ready to step on it, but paused when he saw the printed words Department of Defense, active duty. Silence spread. The crowd began murmuring again, a few zooming in on the card to capture the details. Mercer looked around, realizing at least 3 people were live streaming. He lowered his voice, forcing a grin. not bad for a fake. Dana looked at him, a faint smile touching the corner of her lips. You're digging deeper into the hole you made yourself. Mercer bit his lip, voice tight. You think a few papers scare me? I deal with people like you every day. Always the same lines. I'm being profiled. I'm being disrespected. I'm tired of those cheap excuses. She stood facing him, voice calm but hard as stone. What you call an excuse is the lived reality of millions, he answered with a cold laugh. If they just behaved, no one would bother them. You just said the truth, she replied, eyes locked on his. Mercer's throat felt dry, but pride pushed him to keep attacking. He picked up the pen that had fallen on the hood, threw it to the ground, the plastic snapping in two. Proof from the so-called officer. Looks as cheap as your made-up story. The crowd gasped. An older man stepped forward and said loudly, He's breaking her things. Record that. Mercer spun around. Back off, old man, or I'll arrest you too. The man didn't flinch. I wore the uniform before you were even born. Today, I'm ashamed of the one you're wearing. The words drained color from Mercer's face. He clenched his fists, but then realized every camera was pointed at him. Dana gave the veteran a small nod, her voice soft but firm. Thank you, but there's no need to intervene. I'll handle this myself. Mercer snapped back. Your job is to shut up and follow orders. My job, she answered, is to show that those who give the wrong orders will be held accountable. Mercer exhaled hard anger, turning his eyes bloodshot. He bent down again, picked up her ID card and held it high. Is this name real, or did you borrow it from someone? She replied. That name is the one thing I don't need to prove. He flung the card back. It slid across the hood and dropped to the ground. Go ahead, prove it. I don't believe you're any kind of colonel. Dana didn't speak. She simply bent down, picked up each item, and placed them carefully back into her bag. Every move was quiet, yet every eye in the crowd followed her as if watching a silent trial unfold. As she zipped the bag closed, Mercer stood frozen, breathing hard, his hand shaking. He had done everything he could to humiliate her, but it was her refusal to react that made him feel smaller than ever. She spoke softly, just loud enough for him to hear. Power doesn't make a man strong. It reveals who he really is when he can do wrong and still believes he's right. Mercer stepped back, a flicker of fear flashing through his mind, not because of her rank, but because he had just lost the one thing he believed could never be taken from him, control. And in that exact moment, the sound of a military siren rose in the distance, steady in rhythm, signaling that everything was about to turn. The air seemed to solidify after the badge hit the hood. Colonel Dana Cole clutched her bag tightly, her eyes steady in the middle of a growing crowd. Officer Ryan Mercer was still breathing hard sweat, beating at his temple, but his voice was sharper than before. Are you done? You think I'm just gonna let you walk away? His glare dripped with sarcasm as if to prove he still held control. Dana tilted her head slightly and slowly pulled her phone from her jacket pocket. Her fingers moved across the screen with calm precision. This is Cole. I'm being unlawfully detained by a police officer. Send my location to the Department of Defense. Her voice was not loud, but each word was clear enough that a few in the crowd glanced at each other, unsure what they had just heard. Mercer rushed forward, his hand, raised finger, pointed at her. Who are you calling trash? Rage twisted his face into a mix of fear and wounded pride. Dana turned to face him, her gaze steady. The Pentagon. The answer dropped into the silence and the crowd paused for a moment. Then Mercer let out a bitter laugh, trying to claw back dominance. The Pentagon. What you callin' ghosts? Or your imaginary backup? He laughed louder and turned toward the phone's recording. Keep filming. Show the world a delusional woman who thinks she's a colonel. But no one laughed with him. They only stared, and in those stares was a silence that made his skin itch. Dana held the phone to her ear, its screen light in her determined face. This is Colonel Cole confirming coordinates at Jefferson intersection. I'm being obstructed by an officer. Initiate an emergency link. Her tone was calm like a briefing. Mercer's mouth dropped open. He stepped back half a pace and growled, You're faking that voice. You're nobody." But at that moment, a deep male voice came through the phone, crisp and firm. "Colonel Cole, signal received. Response, unit en route. Maintain a safe position." The words sliced through the air like a blade, leaving no doubt behind. The whole street went still, and the phone stayed pointed at Mercer, fingers frozen on record buttons. He swallowed hard, glanced around, then tried to force a laugh. You hired someone to fake that voice?" Dana lowered the phone, her eyes sharp as a razor. "You just witnessed a call to the Department of Defense. If you continue, your name goes in a federal report." Mercer's hands trembled. Pride wouldn't let him stop. He screamed, voice cracking, "You think a phone call makes me believe you? I've met hundreds of fakes. I'm not scared of you," she replied softly. "Fear isn't something I give you. You feed it yourself every day with your pride." Someone in the crowd whispered, "I heard them call her Colonel." Mercer spun around, finger pointing at the voice. "Shut up. No one interferes." But that only drew the crowd closer, phones rising higher. A middle-aged man spoke clearly. "I worked at the Department of Defense." That voice wasn't fake. Mercer turned back to Dana, his voice faltering. What did you just do?" Dana answered. "What any citizen has the right to do, demand justice." The sound of sirens echoed from a distance, steady and heavy. A few people in the crowd whispered, "That's a military vehicle." Mercer grimaced, trying to look composed, but his fists were clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. He paced around the car, muttering, "Fine. You want to play big? I'll show you what law enforcement really means." Dana watched him, her eyes reading his every move. "You're abusing your authority, and with every word you say, everyone sees it." Mercer stopped his footsteps, striking hard against the pavement. "You trying to destroy my career. I just want you to understand the value of the uniform you're wearing." The wind passed through, making the small flags outside the convenience store flap wildly. The crowd had gone completely silent, with only the sound of sirens growing louder. Mercer looked around and saw unfamiliar faces, camera lenses pointed at him, and his own reflection in the phone screen of the person in front. He realized he was the one on trial, right here in the middle of the street under daylight. Dana remained still, phone in hand, her voice measured. "I've reported the incident. You're welcome to wait with me if you want to learn what consequences look like." Mercer stepped back, his lips moving without sound, the words caught in his throat. He understood now that the power game he had staged had hit its limit, and for the first time in his life he was afraid of the sirens echoing through the city, a sound now carrying the shape of justice drawn near. The voice on the phone came through strong and firm, not a second of hesitation. "Colonel Cole, response unit is en route." The sentence cracked through the air like lightning, and the whole street seemed to drop into silence. The crowd went still, and even the distant sound of traffic faded. Officer Ryan Mercer stood, frozen eyes wide, face blank, as if he had just heard a language beyond comprehension. Seconds later, he let out a hoarse shout. "No way, you're just an actress." His voice rang out clearly in the videos being recorded, shaky and strained, trying to sound tough. Dana kept the phone to her ear for another beat, then calmly ended the call, the motion deliberate, like a sentence being signed. She looked straight at Mercer, and her eyes held not anger, but a bitter understanding. Mercer kept yelling like an animal cornered. "You staged this, didn't you? Those people on the line are your friends? You rented the car, hired the voices." He laughed loud and broken, the sound warped and erratic. Dana didn't move. The wind swept her hair back, and the light hit her just right, making her stand out in the street like a monument. A woman in the crowd whispered, "He's scared now." Another answered, "No, he's fighting the truth." Mercer looked around, those staring eyes closing in on him, making it hard to breathe. His arrogance dissolved like foam, leaving only the raw shape of shame. He backed towards the patrol car, mumbling, "No, this can't be." Then came the heavy hum of an engine, steady and low, like a drum drumbeat in a military parade. From the far end of the street, a black SUV with 5-star military plates appeared, moving slowly but with purpose. A small American flag fluttered on the front, catching the sunlight, freezing the scene like a photograph. The crowd stepped aside, phones raised lenses tracking every second. Mercer stepped back again, his hands shaking so badly the holstered gun at his side gave a soft rattle. The car door opened and 2 officers in green military uniforms stepped out, their movements sharp, their eyes scanning the crowd before locking on Dana. One of them spoke, voice deep and steady. "Colonel, are you all right?" In that moment, all of Jefferson Street seemed to hold its breath. Mercer stepped back again, his face drained of all color. Someone in the crowd shouted, "She really is a colonel." Cheers, mixed with the sound of camera shutters firing nonstop, flashes bursting from every direction. Donna gave a small nod, replying to the officers. "I'm fine, thank you." Her voice was calm, steady, without a tremor. Mercer struggled to stay upright, clutching the patrol car door, mouth dry. What is this? Who is she?" One of the officers looked at him, eyes hard as steel. "You just pulled over Colonel Cole, Department of Defense. You will be questioned about your actions." Mercer let out a broken laugh, his voice faltering. "Questioned? I was just doing my job. I didn't know." The other officer cut him off. "You don't need to know to show respect." The words hit like a hammer. Dana stepped closer, not to retaliate, but to look directly at the man who had humiliated her in the middle of the street. Their eyes met, and in that gaze, Mercer saw something he had never allowed himself to face: the smallness of a man once power was no longer his shield. "You asked me who I am," she said softly. "I'm the one you were supposed to protect." Mercer backed into the car door, his eyes drifting away. The 2 officers stood behind him. One said, "We need to document the entire incident." The crowd parted, forming a circle, camera shutters clicking nonstop. Mercer cast a desperate look around, but all he saw were strangers' faces, eyes filled with anger. Someone filming shouted. He called her trash. "It's all recorded." Mercer raised his hand and yelled, "This was a setup. Y'all just wanted to disgrace me." An officer replied firmly, "No one can disgrace you but your own actions." Dana said nothing more. She simply turned away. The military SUV came to a full stop at the curb. The back door opened, creating a pocket of stillness on the street. The wind blew, making the American flag whip against the breeze. One officer gestured for Mercer to remove his weapon. He hesitated, then obeyed, his hands shaking so badly the gun nearly slipped. The metallic tap of it hitting the vehicle's side rang with a strange chill. Dana looked at him, her voice no longer sharp, just firm. "I didn't want to destroy you. I only wanted you to understand that respect isn't a favor, it's a duty." That sentence made Mercer lower his eyes, his breathing unsteady, his whole body sinking as if drained. He muttered, "You really are a colonel?" Dana nodded, her voice low and tired. "And are you really a police officer of my country?" No one said anything. One of the officers stepped forward, placed a hand on her shoulder, and leaned in slightly. "Requesting permission to escort you safely," she replied. "I'll stay until they finish the report." Mercer watched, eyes vacant, sweat trailing down his cheek. The crowd began to applaud, not for victory, but because justice had appeared in the middle of an ordinary street. In that sound, Mercer lowered his head, one hand still gripping the edge of the car, as if he were about to slip away from the very world he thought he controlled. Just hours after the incident on Jefferson Street, the clip titled, "Who Are You Calling?" The Pentagon had flooded every major social media platform. The video was less than a minute long, but every frame lit a fire that sent the entire country into outrage. The image of Colonel Dana Cole standing calm in the face of Officer Ryan Mercer's fury, her voice clear and resolute, and the slow-motion shot of her saying, "The Pentagon became iconic." People shared it, edited it, captioned it, set it to music, turning that moment into a statement about the dignity of those long disrespected. The hashtags hashtags #Colonel Cole and #Pentagon Call climbed to the top of trending charts in under 2 hours. Major news outlets ran headlines like "Officer pulled over the wrong one" and "When silence outranks power." In the comment sections, millions poured out their anger. One user wrote, "If she hadn't been a colonel, they would have destroyed her just for her skin color." Another said, "Thank God she recorded it. Without that video, this story would be twisted like so many others." Timelines filled with images of Dana standing tall, gaze steady under dozens of lenses, sharply contrasted with Mercer's pale face backing away when the voice from the Department of Defense came through. The entire nation watched a moment flip when justice stopped being an idea and became undeniable evidence. Evening news broadcasts opened with that very clip. The anchor's voice came steady. An Arlington City police officer has been placed on temporary suspension after a video surfaced showing him verbally assaulting a female military officer. The scene of two military vehicles stopped in the street played again and again, and each time Dana's quiet presence seemed even more powerful. She didn't raise her voice, didn't argue, didn't beg, just one line. The Pentagon was enough to shake the entire system. A political commentator on a primetime panel said, "She proves that dignity doesn't have to shout to be heard." Online, the storm hadn't calmed. Forums resurfaced Mercer's previous complaints about aggressive behavior. One self-claimed former colleague posted, "He always targeted the vulnerable. Now he picked the wrong one." A zoomed-in clip of Mercer calling Dana trash was shared hundreds of thousands of times, becoming a symbol of long-suppressed fury. Captions read, "This isn't just an incident. This is America's mirror." Meanwhile, Dana sat at home in a small living room, the glow of the screen light in her face. Her phone buzzed constantly. Texts, calls, emails from newspapers and television stations. She didn't answer. The screen displayed thousands of notifications, but she opened only one message. "We're proud of you, Colonel," sent from a former teammate. The brief sentence carried the weight of deep respect. Dana set the phone down on the table, took a deep breath, and looked toward the framed military badge beside her. It still shone unscathed, though it had once clattered across a car hood under the weight of humiliation. Outside, the public firestorm had grown beyond control. A small, spontaneous protest formed in front of the police station, people holding signs that read, "Respect before power." A phrase from Dana's earlier news clip had become a rallying cry. A mother told a reporter, "I teach my son that no one has a right to humiliate him no matter what uniform they wear." That sentence was shared hundreds of thousands of times. In many places, human rights groups called for a full review of disciplinary records within the local police force. Mercer became the focus of the outrage. His outburst, "You calling ghosts," turned into a meme that spread everywhere. International media outlets began picking up the video, calling it a new symbol of American justice. A European newspaper wrote, "A strong nation is not one where police can bend the law, but where citizens dare to remind them of its limits." The quote was translated into multiple languages, accompanied by images of Dana. But amid the cheers and praise, she remained silent. When a former teammate called and asked why she hadn't spoken to the media, she answered briefly, "I don't want to win by noise. I want them to hear the silence of truth." The media gave her a nickname, the Calm Storm. They wrote that she didn't need to explode with anger because everything she did made others reflect. On television programs, they froze the moment when she set her phone down and Mercer stepped back, added background music, and narrated, "This is the moment a nation saw itself." Online, new accounts emerged under the name Colonel Cole, spreading her message of dignity and justice. That night, Dana sat by the window watching the city lights reflect on the glass. She knew her life would never be quiet again after that video, but the thought didn't frighten her. She had seen war, and this was a different kind of battle between prejudice and human dignity. In the corner of the room, the screen kept playing the image of her on Jefferson Street standing tall in silence. That light cast itself on the ceiling, blending with the sound of rain outside the window, a quiet reminder that sometimes justice doesn't arrive with gunfire, but with a sentence strong enough to make the world stop. 2 days after the incident, the online storm still hadn't calmed. Major newspapers ran bold headlines, and images of Officer Ryan Mercer and Colonel Dinah Cole dominated every morning broadcast. People flooded the streets holding signs printed with the words, "Respect before power." The pressure mounted so quickly that the police department was forced to hold an emergency press conference. The room was packed with reporters' cameras pointed squarely at the podium. Police Chief Alan Brewer, a gray-haired man, adjusted the microphone, his voice trying to stay steady. "The Arlington Police Department views this as an unfortunate misunderstanding. We will conduct an internal investigation and take appropriate action." As soon as the phrase, "a misunderstanding," was spoken, the room erupted in noise. A female reporter stood up, her voice cutting through the rows of seats. "Sir is calling her trash. What you mean by misunderstanding?" The question hit like a hammer, drawing gasps from those nearby. Brewer hesitated, avoiding eye contact. "I'm not trying to excuse anything, but every incident has multiple perspectives." Another reporter jumped in. "Are you saying there's a perspective where that kind of insult makes sense?" The air thickened. Cameras panned across the room, capturing the chief's unease. He took a breath and said mechanically, "I just want to emphasize that any conclusion must follow protocol." But the room had stopped listening. His words had already answered the question. Protection still existed, even when the truth was plain to see. Outside, the crowd waiting at headquarters erupted like dry grass meeting fire. Chants of justice for Cole echoed through the streets. Protesters held signs, some wiping tears as they watched the video play on a large screen mounted above the square. A middle-aged man told a local reporter if she wasn't a colonel, they'd have buried this like hundreds of other cases. That sentence spread quickly, fueling another wave of outrage. In cities across the country, hundreds marched in silence, holding signs that read, "Silence is no longer safe." Meanwhile, in a small apartment in western Washington, Dana was rewatching the press conference on screen. She sat back in her chair, her eyes still as water. The image of the police chief speaking of a misunderstanding reflected off her face, each word a reminder that the system she once believed in was still protecting itself. The phone rang. On the line was a reporter from CNN. "Colonel Cole, the public wants to hear your voice. Do you plan to speak?" Dana paused for a few seconds, her gaze turning toward the window where the afternoon sun poured in. "Yes," she said, "but I won't speak to retaliate. I want them to understand why this happened." The interview aired live that evening. The studio was brightly lit, and the host opened with a recap video before inviting her to speak. Dana dressed simply, her voice calm, each word steady and firm. "I don't need a personal apology. I need collective change." The host paused, then asked, "Do you think Mercer deserves to be fired?" She answered, her gaze unwavering. "I think what's more frightening is that there are thousands like him who still believe power gives them the right to diminish others." The answer left the studio in silence. The host nodded slowly, repeating her words. Collective change, as if to summarize the entire broadcast. Within hours, that phrase had become a national slogan. From social media posts to digital billboards, the 4 words collective change appeared everywhere. On Twitter, people paired Dana's image with the quote, "I don't need a personal apology," beneath the hashtag #respect before power. A veteran journalist commented, "She didn't speak with anger, she spoke with truth, and that's why people listen." Universities organized forums on racial bias in law enforcement, and students raised banners bearing her name. Late at night in a small cafe in the suburbs, 2 young men rewatched the interview on a phone. One said, "She didn't have to shout, just speak, and that gave me chills." The other replied, maybe because she said what everyone knows, but no one dares to admit. In the dark, the screen's glow lit their faces, reflecting a generation beginning to ask itself if justice truly exists, whose side will it take? In her room, Dana turned off the television, the screen's light giving way to darkness. She set her phone down on the table and took a deep breath, feeling both relief and weight settle inside her. She understood the fight had only just begun. The noise of public reaction would fade, but to change a system, she had to do more than tell a story. Outside, wind moved through into the trees, carrying echoes from the distant square, where thousands still chanted her name into the night, believing that from a moment of humiliation, a new chapter of America was being rewritten. On the third morning after Colonel Dana Cole's interview, Washington was no longer quiet. The gates of the Department of Defense were crowded with reporters, and breaking news updates rolled across every major network. In a large conference room at the Pentagon, generals and legal advisors reviewed the footage again. Every detail slowed down, each word spoken by Officer Ryan Mercer, noted and documented. A silver-bearded general slammed his hand on the table, his voice sharp. This is not just an insult to one individual, it's an insult to the military. A federal investigation is necessary. No one disagreed. An hour later, an official directive was issued requesting the Department of Justice to open a special investigation into racially motivated abuse of authority within law enforcement. At the same time, the video was submitted directly to the Senate Judiciary Committee as evidence for an upcoming hearing. The news spread like wildfire. Every media outlet reported Department of Defense calls for federal investigation into Colonel Cole case. A red headline scrolled across screens showing Dana standing in the middle of Jefferson Street in the lower corner with Mercer pictured beside her, head bowed as he exited the police station. He had been suspended, his uniform temporarily withdrawn. In footage from a field reporter, Mercer walked past the crowd under a wave of boos, his hand covering his face, eyes darting away. A reporter called out, "Do you regret it, Officer Mercer?" He gave no answer, only lowered his head and walked silently through the wall of cameras. That moment was captured and spread widely on social media with millions of shares, thousands of comments, and one word showing up again and again: karma. While the public erupted, Dana continued working inside a small office at the Arlington military complex. She typed each line of her internal report, reading aloud as a habit of someone long trained in discipline. This is not the first time a black service member has been disrespected by police. I do not write this to demand justice for myself, but to remind the system that a soldier's dignity is not tied to rank. It's in how society sees us. She paused, eyes drifting out of the window toward the gray sky beyond the Capitol dome. Beside her desk, her framed military badge reflected the light, a quiet reminder that this battle wasn't fought on foreign soil, but within her own country. That afternoon, CNN aired a special interview with the Secretary of Defense. He spoke slowly, each word deliberate. No one is allowed to humiliate a military officer, especially not because of race. The honor of a soldier is the honor of the nation. His statement echoed across the United States, reposted on every social platform. Images pairing the quote with Dana's face flooded the internet. Commentators called it a turning point for the system. A former senator remarked, "Never before have I seen the Department of Defense initiate a formal request to the Senate over a civilian matter. That tells you just how far the line has been crossed." On the other side, the Arlington Police Department had fallen into chaos. Dozens of calls, emails, interview requests, and formal complaints flooded in all at once. Young officers stayed silent, avoiding eye contact with citizens while on patrol. Chief Brewer repeatedly appeared on television, repeating one line, "We are cooperating with the investigation." But each time he spoke, public anger only grew. A black woman standing outside the precinct addressed the crowd. "They only cooperate once the light's been turned on." How many other cases were buried in the dark? That evening, thousands of people gathered at the Arlington Police Headquarters carrying white candles. The glow of the flames reflected on the gray brick walls, illuminating the phrase, "Respect before power," painted in red. Among the crowd were veterans in uniform, mothers and children. A middle-aged man spoke into a megaphone. "We don't light these candles to burn anyone, but to expose what they have tried to hide." Dana watched the scene unfold on television quietly, her eyes glassy. She heard the reporter narrate, "Tonight there are no chants, no signs, only the light of belief." The image reminded her of her first year of training when her commander said, "A soldier's light doesn't come from victory but from standing tall in the dark." At 10 o'clock, international news outlets reported Senate officially accepts Colonel Cole case file. On Twitter, a video of Mercer bowing his head was paired with footage of thousands holding candles. The caption reading, "One man bowed, thousands stood tall." The image went viral, and even conservative political channels admitted this story has moved beyond party lines. In a small cafe, a group of students debated the future of policing. One young woman said, "Maybe they don't hate black people, maybe they were just taught that power is something you prove," her friend replied. And now, one woman showed them power won't save you from your mistakes. Late that night, Donna received an email from the secretary's office. It contained just one sentence. "Thank you for not staying silent." She sat at her desk, hands clasped, eyes resting on the light outside her window. In the distance, sirens faded into the night wind, rustling through the trees, forming a sound both cold and clear. For the first time in years, she felt that silence could become a kind of voice. Out there, thousands of candles still burned, each one a small piece of faith and justice. And at the center of it all, her name, Colonel Dana Cole, was no longer just a person but a symbol of an awakening system. 1 week after the candlelight vigil at Arlington Police Headquarters, public pressure forced the federal government to act. The National Human Rights Commission announced an independent investigation into discriminatory practices within law enforcement. News outlets across the country ran headlines, "Government demands transparency. Colonel Cole case becomes a turning point." The hearing was held in the Capitol, a place usually filled with political promises, now weighed down by the truth of a case that once seemed small. Dana was invited as the primary witness. Throughout the morning, officials, journalists, and representatives from multiple states packed the chamber. She entered in full uniform, the light catching the silver on her shoulders, carrying the solemn presence of someone who had known the battlefield. The room was so still, you could hear the scratch of pens. The committee chair spoke first. "Colonel Cole, can you recount the incident from your perspective?" Dana nodded, her voice low but clear. "I think what people saw in the video was only the surface. What's more frightening lies beneath a man who believed he could humiliate someone without consequence." She paused, her eyes landing on the row of senior officers. He wasn't afraid to violate protocol because he believed the system would protect him. The sentence rang through the hall, not shouted, but strong enough to command silence. A reporter scribbled into a notebook, "The most accurate description of power, gone rotten." She recounted in detail what had happened, the way Mercer looked at her with disdain, how he yanked her bag, how those nearby remained silent out of fear of the badge. "I've seen that kind of fear in war," she said, "but this time it came from people who share my nationality." When a police officer believes his identity gives him the right to insult others, the issue is no longer individual, it's structural. Committee members took notes. Some nodded, others leaned back heavily in their seats. One congresswoman asked, "What made you choose silence instead of reacting?" Dana answered, "Because I know noise makes people cover their ears, but calm forces them to listen." The room thickened with that answer. Outside, hundreds watched the hearing on a large screen. They clapped when she appeared and fell quiet when she spoke. A journalist wrote, "Not an accusation, but a mirror." During questioning, a committee member asked, "Do you believe the system can be reformed?" Dana thought for a moment, then said, "I don't believe in instant change, but I believe in beginnings. Every system can learn again if it's brave enough to admit it was wrong." Her voice was steady, her gaze directed at the observation observation seats where young officers were watching. She wanted them to know she wasn't there to get someone fired, but to remind them of the responsibility that comes with the uniform they wear. When the hearing ended, the chairperson gave closing thanks and asked everyone to rise. Applause filled the room long and steady, without cheering, only respect. News outlets immediately replayed the clip of her saying he believed the system would protect him. The sentence became the cornerstone of a nationwide discussion on transparency in policing. One newspaper wrote, "Her testimony went beyond a single case. It exposed a decades-old distortion in the foundation of trust." That evening, as Dana exited the Capitol, people lined both sides of the street, waving. She nodded slightly, not smiling, her eyes distant, fixed on the flags fluttering ahead. In the golden light of sunset, her posture recalled the image of a soldier finishing a different kind of battle, one without gunfire, but louder than any explosion. A brief but weighty moment unfolded during the hearing. Just as Colonel Dana Cole finished speaking, a sigh passed through the front row of lawmakers, followed by a voice from the committee, a silver-haired man, once a civil rights attorney, speaking into the silence. And it's that very belief that broke justice. The words echoed through the chamber, prompting note-takers to look up. No one responded immediately, but in that instant it became clear this was no longer an inquiry into a single incident. It was an indictment of a system that had protected the illusion of privilege in a uniform. Dana turned toward the man who had spoken. Their eyes met, no thanks exchanged, only a silent agreement between two people who had both seen justice twisted. The hearing concluded, but the impact of that statement rippled outward like a wave. Television networks clipped and rebroadcast the moment dozens of times during the evening news. The image of the man, bowing his head, hands resting on the table, his voice measured. And it's that very belief that broke justice. Within hours, the line became a lead headline across major news platforms. Some called it a painful confession, others a warning bell. On social media, video analyses spread at lightning speed. Debates erupted over the idea of belief in power, the force that convinces law enforcers they stand above the law. A journalist wrote on Twitter, "Justice doesn't die from mistakes. It dies from the belief that mistakes will always be forgiven." That tweet garnered millions of shares, turning the hearing into a national reckoning. Meanwhile, political talk shows launched segment after segment titled, "When Justice Loses Faith in Itself." Former officers, civil rights activists, and legal scholars sat at round tables debating fiercely. One said, "The system isn't broken, only the people are weak." Another countered, "When weak people are propped up by the system, then it's no longer just a personal failure." Millions watched live, and amid the clash of voices, Dana's face reappeared, a symbol of a truth that could no longer be ignored. CNN's evening news opened with a headline running across the screen, "The Belief That Broke Justice." Universities launched forums and students hung banners quoting that very sentence. A law professor at Harvard stood before his class and said, "We're teaching justice, but we have to begin by explaining why people no longer believe in it." Essays, op-eds, podcasts, and analysis videos sprang up everywhere, each offering a different perspective, but circling around the same question: where does belief in power come from, and who allowed it to exist for so long? In local police departments, the atmosphere was tense. Some young officers felt hurt, believing they were being unfairly lumped together, while others stayed silent, knowing that the statement had struck a real wound. That night, inside the Department of Defense office, an aide placed a cup of coffee in front of Dana and said quietly, "They're talking about you on every channel." She replied, her voice soft as wind, "Good. At least they're talking about justice." She looked out the window, where city lights reflected off the glass, blending with the deep purple sky of the Capitol's evening. Inside her, there was no feeling of victory, only the weight of what had just been revealed, a door to truth. The country now had no choice but to face. Somewhere out there, the words, "And it's that very belief that broke justice were still being replayed, echoing through speakers and analysis clips and the voices of young people discussing the future. For the first time in years, people realize that justice doesn't collapse. In one night, it erodes day by day when distorted beliefs are accepted as normal. And it was from that moment forward that America began a dialogue with itself again, with truth, with courage, and with one sentence that shook the entire system. 3 weeks after the explosive hearing, a surprising news segment aired on national television. Officer Ryan Mercer appeared in a short recorded video, his face, tired eyes avoiding the camera. He sat in front of the lens, reading from a sheet of paper on the table. "I apologize to Colonel Cole for my uncontrolled behavior. I didn't know she was a colonel." The words came out disjointed, his voice dry like a duty carried out under orders rather than genuine remorse. The network replayed the clip multiple times during the evening news, cutting between Mercer's bowed head and the moment Dana stared him down in the middle of Jefferson Street. The anchor read a viewer comment. So what if she hadn't been a colonel? A question that quickly sparked a new wave of outrage stronger than previous reports. Online, the public reacted with fury, calling the apology a slap in the face to collective awareness. One widely shared comment read, "He apologized for her rank, not her dignity." Thousands voiced their disgust in the replies, saying Mercer still didn't understand what had enraged the nation. Another comment said, "If she hadn't been a colonel, he probably would have slept well after destroying someone's life." That line was quoted by several major newspapers as evidence of the moral decay within public service. Political analysts debated it during evening broadcasts. This apology wasn't about restoring anyone's honor, it was a last-ditch effort to protect the honor of the system. On the other side, Dana received a copy of the letter via email from the Department of Defense. She read it all without expression. The letter ended with the words, "I hope you can forgive me." She set the phone down, her eyes resting on the corner of the room where a photo of her and her unit from military graduation hung. They had once fought to protect freedom, and now she realized freedom was sometimes distorted by apologies written to meet expectations, not conscience. In a closed meeting, a spokesperson asked if she wanted to respond publicly. She simply said, "No need. I'm not seeking regret, I'm seeking awareness." That evening, television replayed footage of Mercer leaving the police station surrounded by reporters. One shouted, "Are you sorry because you're afraid or because you truly regret it?" He didn't answer, rushed past his face, buried in the blinding flash of cameras. The scene only deepened public anger. A woman in a street interview said, "Men like him don't apologize because they feel wrong, but because they're afraid of being caught again." News outlets ran the headline, "An apology for the rank, not the person." Amid the noise, Dana chose silence. She knew that any apology not born of awareness was meaningless because justice does not need bowed heads. It needs people who can face truth. And in that moment, America began relearning the true meaning of the word sorry. The next morning, while the media was still abuzz over Officer Ryan Mercer's clumsy apology letter, Colonel Dana Cole stepped out of the Capitol building after a brief meeting with the Department of Defense. Reporters swarmed around her microphones, pointed in her direction. Dozens of questions hurled at once. What do you think of Mercer's apology? Do you plan to forgive him? Do you feel more respected now? Dana paused on the stone steps, a breeze stirring her hair, sunlight reflecting off her silver epaulette. She looked straight into the cameras, her voice calm and steady. "I represent millions of people who don't need a rank to deserve respect." The line wasn't rehearsed, but once spoken, it spread like wildfire. The entire row of reporters fell silent for a few seconds, then a flurry of shutters went off. In that moment, Dana was no longer just an officer. She became the voice of those who had been dismissed for their skin color, status, or origin. That evening, the news replayed the moment dozens of times. The ticker across the screen read, "I represent millions of people who don't need a rank to deserve respect." The anchor said, "This is the line that made America pause and reflect." Online, the word respect became the most searched term of the week, surpassing political events and celebrity gossip. Major newspapers published op-eds titled "Respect, the shortest yet heaviest word in America." A writer from The Atlantic noted Dana Cole wasn't speaking for herself. She was stating a truth: people don't need titles to be worthy of dignity. Her words spread like a reminder to a generation adrift in a culture obsessed with power. On social platforms, people began sharing their stories under the hashtag #respect. A teacher wrote, "My students once mocked me for how I look. Today I taught them that respect doesn't come from fear." A nurse commented, "I thought about the times I was yelled at in the hospital and realized she had spoken the words we've all held inside." The small stories poured in like a stream merging into the wave. Dana had unintentionally sparked a wave, not driven by anger, but by awareness. In New York, a shop printed the quote on black t-shirts with white lettering, selling out in one morning. In Los Angeles, a mural of Donna with a calm gaze was completed overnight with the caption below, "Respect is the rank of humanity." Donna was invited to appear on the program Evening Focus to speak about the meaning behind her words. When the host asked, "Why do you think that word resonated with so many people?" she answered simply, "Because it's the simplest thing we've forgotten the longest." Her reply prompted a long round of applause from the studio audience. The host bowed his head and said, "Thank you for getting this country to say a word we thought we knew." On social media, millions changed their profile photos to a single word: respect. Schools held themed assemblies where children wrote on the board, "Respect begins with a look." At the White House, when asked about the incident, a spokesperson responded, "We support all efforts to restore faith in the value of respect." Late at night, Dana returned to her small apartment, turned off the lights, and sat by the window. The city still blazed with lights, traffic still flowed, but inside she felt a strange stillness. She understood that her words weren't just for those who looked like her, but also for those who once stood opposed. Because when people learn to respect each other, skin color stops being a boundary, rank stops being a measure, and justice stops being a distant dream. Outside, the word respect still glowed across the giant billboard in Times Square, shining like a reminder that every great revolution begins with a simple sentence true enough to make the world stop and look again. On a May morning, the federal courthouse in Washington was packed. Lines of reporters, activists, and citizens filled the halls waiting for news. The trial of Officer Ryan Mercer officially began with 3 charges: abuse of power, racial discrimination, and fabricating a traffic stop. The atmosphere turned heavy the moment the gavel struck. On the defendant's bench, Mercer kept his head down, the dark suit making him look small in the wide courtroom. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, and he avoided all gazes from the public seats. Across the room, Colonel Dana Cole sat in the witness section, posture upright, eyes focused. She wasn't there for revenge, but to testify to the truth. The federal prosecutor stood, voice calm but sharp. "Your Honor, this was not just an unlawful traffic stop. It is a symbol of a broken system where power is used to humiliate, not to protect." He motioned for the technician to play the video evidence. The room went silent as the footage appeared on the large screen. Mercer's voice echoed through the chamber. "Trash, you think I'm gonna believe you?" The crude shout made many flinch. Dana kept her gaze steady, hands lightly clasped on her knees. The prosecutor pointed to the screen. This wasn't a momentary lapse. This was an attitude. The attitude of a man who believed he couldn't be punished. The defense attorney rose in protest, voice sharp. "My client temporarily lost control. He did not intend to offend." The prosecutor responded instantly without glancing at his notes. "No intent to offend, yet he called someone trash. No intent to abuse power, yet he slammed his hand on her car. Your Honor, this isn't a lapse. It's a belief system fed by the system itself." Murmurs filled the courtroom. Some nodded quietly, others looked down in shame. The judge signaled for silence, but his eyes betrayed his anger. When called to testify, Dana stood, her voice steady and slow. "I served 20 years in the military. I've faced bullets, but I've never seen contempt in someone's eyes the way I did that day." Mercer wasn't afraid of wrongdoing because he believed the system would cover for him, and that's what hurt me the most. The room grew heavier. The prosecutor asked, "Do you believe he truly regrets his actions?" Dana replied, "No, because he doesn't think he was wrong. He just thinks he was unlucky to pick the wrong person." A few sighed in the audience, and some clapped briefly before being warned by security. The defense tried to salvage ground. Officer Mercer has a clean record, years of service without violations. But the prosecutor cut in, "A clean past doesn't erase the present, especially when the present is recorded by millions of eyes." He submitted more evidence, copies of complaints filed against Mercer over the past 3 years, all related to aggressive behavior toward people of color. The courtroom buzzed. Mercer bowed lower, sweat beading on his forehead. The judge leaned forward and declared, "Every excuse is void when the evidence is the man's own actions." When the court recessed, reporters flooded the hallway. The phrase "trash" from the video replayed across every news broadcast, becoming a symbol of unchecked, shameless power. Commentators poured in. Every word he said is living proof. Justice doesn't need an apology, it needs accountability. That afternoon, as the trial resumed, the judge asked Mercer to stand, his gaze cold. "Do you have anything to say before the court deliberates?" Mercer mumbled, I'm sorry," but no one responded. In the gallery, Dana quietly looked down, her face expressionless, like someone who had accepted that justice had finally begun to move. Outside, light rain tapped against the windows, closing one chapter of abuse and opening another of accountability and honor. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick, as if everyone was holding their breath. Colonel Dana Cole sat in the front row, calm among dozens of reporters' lenses aimed at her. Light from the high windows slanted across her hair, casting a silhouette on the wall behind her, a figure both firm and quiet. When the prosecutor ended his closing argument, every eye turned to Mercer, but Dana didn't look over. She sat still, hands clasped, her gaze steady, not hateful but resolute. In her eyes there was no triumph, no thirst for revenge, only the quiet of someone who had walked through long battles and understood that justice isn't joy, but a way to restore balance to the world. Mercer stared down the microphone before him, silent. He knew any defense was now meaningless, because the truth had been laid bare before the public, before the very people he once saw as subjects to control. The judge's voice rang out, solemn and final. "The jury will now deliberate and deliver a verdict." In that moment, no one moved, no one spoke. The footsteps of the 12 jurors echoed evenly, disappearing behind the wooden door. Donna lifted her head, scanning the courtroom filled with ordinary citizens, veterans, students, and those who had once suffered injustice. She knew the sentence itself mattered less than the fact that people had finally chosen to see the truth. In the hallway, dozens stood waiting. A middle-aged woman held her son's hand and whispered, "See, this is what happens when someone thinks they're above others." The boy nodded, eyes fixed on the wall screen replaying Dana in court. Inside, when the door reopened, the courtroom went completely silent. The court clerk spoke. "The jury has reached a verdict." The 12 filed back into place, exchanging brief glances, and the foreperson stood, voice clear enough for every word to echo against the walls, "Guilty." That sound rang out, brief but heavy enough to end a dark chapter. Mercer collapsed into his seat, both hands gripping the edge of the table, eyes vacant. A few whispers rose, then fell silent as the judge struck the gavel. "The court finds the defendant, Ryan Mercer, guilty of abuse of power, racial discrimination, and fabricating a traffic stop. This trial is concluded." The sentence closed the case but opened many other doors, questions about the system, about belief, about accountability. In the gallery, some people wept, and a veteran veteran stood to salute Dana. She responded with a quiet nod, her gaze as steady as it had been when walking in. As she exited the courtroom, reporters shouted over each other, but Dana said only one sentence: "Justice doesn't come to punish, it comes to reset the measure of who we are." The words were captured and broadcast across the evening news. Outside, the last sunlight of the day cast a glow over the courthouse's worn stone steps, and as she walked down, the crowd parted on its own. Some applauded, others bowed their heads in silence. Mercer was escorted out a separate way, hands cuffed, footsteps heavy. In the distance, handwritten signs still rose high, respect before power. In the evening wind, the words fluttered like a reminder that every verdict doesn't just close a case, it begins an awakening. Dana paused for a moment, looking out at the crowd, then walked on quiet but full of strength, the steps of someone who understood that justice only holds meaning when upheld by conviction, not by vengeance. As the public was still reeling from the federal court's verdict, a new development pushed the case to another level. The Internal Investigation Committee released additional testimonies, and this time they didn't come from the victim or outside witnesses, but from former colleagues of Officer Ryan Mercer himself. In a closed hearing, a retired officer who had once worked with him stated bluntly, he used to brag about teaching lessons to black drivers with nice cars. For Mercer, it wasn't duty, it was entertainment. The statement was documented quickly, entered into the prosecution's file, and leaked to the press. Within hours, major news outlets reported the revelation. Emergency news segments relaunched the series Justice After Colonel Cole, and this time everyone understood Mercer wasn't a victim of a moment's anger, but a man who had nurtured prejudice throughout his entire career. A short press conference was held at the Department of Justice. The federal prosecutor stepped up to the podium, facing a cluster of microphones from international media outlets. He spoke slowly, clearly, each word etched as if meant to engrave itself into the public's conscience. This was not an accident, it was a pattern. The room fell silent. He continued, "We have gathered sufficient evidence showing that Mercer repeatedly stopped black drivers without cause, threatened them, insulted them, and treated it as an act of power. The incident with Colonel Cole was simply the tipping point, a moment where the truth could no longer be hidden." Keyboard clicks echoed through the room as hundreds of reporters took notes. In the hallway, crowds watched the press conference on large screens, their faces a mix of anger and fatigue. Anger at the truth and fatigue from realizing it had gone unspoken for too long. The next day, television stations aired the interview of Mercer's former colleague, his face weary, eyes downcast. "I once heard him say, 'If they want to live like they're upper class, they better learn how to bow their heads.' I stayed silent. Now I regret it." The statement left many viewers choked up. A journalist commented, "Silence is the wall that lets prejudice stand." Editorials across major newspapers carried the same headline, "The Habit Justice's Real Enemy." On televised talk shows, sociologists began deeper analyses. When misconduct becomes a habit, the law is no longer strong enough to stop it. It must be replaced by a culture of respect. These discussions shifted the conversation beyond Mercer or Dana and into the heart of the issue, how the system had nurtured this mindset of power and entitlement. At the Department of Defense, Dana watched the broadcast in silence. She wasn't surprised, only quietly observing the image of the former colleague bowing his head on screen. She understood that his willingness to speak up was already a significant step forward in an environment where silence had long been considered safe. When a reporter called to ask for her reaction to the new testimony, she replied, "Every change begins with someone brave enough to admit they were wrong, and that is more worthy of respect than any verdict." That evening, the lights in front of Arlington Police Headquarters blazed again. People carried signs bearing the prosecutor's words. This wasn't an accident, it was a pattern. Next to them was the now familiar phrase, respect before power. An elderly man who had once served in the military told a reporter, "They taught us that good habits save lives, but bad habits can kill an entire system of justice." His words were replayed on the evening news, and that night America stayed awake once more, not out of outrage but from a deeper sorrow, the kind that comes when a nation realizes justice is not eroded by enemies from the outside, but by bad habits embedded within the very system everyone thought was safe. As the new testimonies were released, the court convened a special hearing to hear responses from involved parties. The room was packed, camera lights sweeping across every face. Colonel Dana Cole was invited as a supplementary witness, and her presence seemed to still the entire chamber. As she stepped to the stand, she didn't look at anyone, only stopped in front of the microphone, her posture straight. The presiding officer asked simply, "Colonel Cole, do you have any comment on the testimony that the defendant's behavior was habitual?" Dana raised her head, her voice clear, each word ringing evenly through the thickening air. "A police officer with that kind of habit is a danger to all of society." No one responded. Not a single voice interrupted. The room froze beneath the weight of a sentence that sounded simple, yet struck with undeniable force. She continued, her tone steady and firm. "He is not an exception. He is the result of a system that allows contempt to become instinct. When someone wears a uniform and treats demeaning others as routine, justice has already been pushed beyond the borders of law." Her words made those in the front rows look down, some scribbling notes hastily, some gripping their pens tightly, their eyes locked on her every move. A young reporter sitting in the back would later say, "I've never heard a voice so calm that it made an entire room hold its breath." The judge nodded and instructed the clerk to enter her words into the official record verbatim. The prosecutors exchanged glances, needing no further discussion. In the press box, cameras began flashing, capturing the moment over and over. A woman in uniform standing inside the symbol of law, saying what society had avoided for years. The courtroom remained silent, save for the steady clicking of the shutters echoing like the heartbeat of a nation remembering the truth. Mercer lowered his head, both hands clenched tightly on his knees, his breathing shallow, but Donna didn't look in his direction. She knew that if change was still possible, it had to begin with shame. After the hearing, the media widely republished her words, calling them a new declaration for the post-incident era. A major newspaper ran the headline, "The Danger Called Habit, Colonel Cole and a Lesson for the System." News channels replayed the moment she spoke, and each time it aired, viewers fell silent for a few seconds. One commentator wrote, "Her words weren't just for the police, but for all of us, those living in a society where disregard is often justified by the phrase, 'we're used to it.'" In many cities, signs reading, "Habit is not law," began appearing in front of police departments. That evening, during a special news segment, the anchor opened in a solemn tone. When one woman can silence an entire courtroom with just 22 words, we must ask ourselves why those words needed to be said at all. Online, Donna's video reached millions of views within hours, no background music, no flashy headlines, just one voice and the relentless flashes of dozens of cameras. In the corner of the press room, a young reporter smiled while sending in their end-of-day piece, the headline, "Only 6 words, she made justice listen." And out there in the bustle of the crowd, those who had followed Dana's story understood that from the moment that the courtroom fell silent, America had truly begun learning how to speak honestly with itself. The morning of the sentencing, a thin layer of fog blanketed the sky, and the street in front of the federal courthouse was quieter than usual, though the air felt tense like a stretched wire. Hundreds of reporters waited, cameras pointed toward the old stone steps. Inside, Officer Ryan Mercer sat between 2 guards, his eyes blank, his face gaunt after months of house detention. The gallery still held people who came to witness, including Colonel Dana Cole, invited as an honorary witness. She sat in the second row, hands resting neatly on her knees, eyes fixed on the judge. When the gavel struck struck, the courtroom fell into absolute silence. The judge rose, voice solemn, each word landing with the weight of justice. The court hereby removes Ryan Mercer from law enforcement permanently and sentences him to 2 years in prison for abuse of power, racial discrimination, and obstruction of justice. In that moment, no one spoke, no applause, no sighs. Only silence spread like a thin veil across the courtroom. Mercer shut his eyes tightly, gripping the edge of his chair, veins bulging at his wrists. He didn't look at anyone, his lips trembling as if to say something, but he swallowed it down. A journalist in the press row captured the moment and later wrote, "That was the moment a man realized truth doesn't come from the verdict, from having nothing left to justify." The judge gave a slight nod and motioned for the officers. 2 guards approached, cuffed Mercer, and escorted him out, their footsteps soft but heavy against the tiled floor. Outside, the crowd lining the courthouse steps began murmuring as the doors swung open. Flashbulbs popped continuously. Dana was the last to step out, her posture upright and steady. She didn't speak to the press, didn't pause. When a reporter stepped forward and asked, "Do you feel justice was served?" she simply shook her head, eyes lifted upward. At the top of the courthouse column, the American flag waved against the gray sky, yasset rustling in the breeze. She paused for a few seconds, not to admire, but as if in silent conversation with something deeper. The sentence closed a case, but to her, it was only the visible tip of an iceberg that the entire society still needed to examine. That evening, news programs used the image of her standing beneath the flag as the final frame. The anchor said, she didn't speak, didn't cry, but that image said it all. Millions watched, and within seconds, social media was flooded with comments about the moment. One read, "She looked at the flag not out of pride, but to make sure it was still worth looking up to." Another wrote, 2 years in prison won't change history, but her eyes changed how we see it." Those words spread quickly, becoming the next chapter in a conversation that has yet to end. Night fell as Dana returned to her small apartment, removed her uniform, and placed it on the chair, then stepped onto the balcony to look at the city glowing under yellow lights. On the street below, a few people still held the same old signs, respect before power. She knew justice was not measured by a sentence, but by what people learn afterward. A battle had ended, but the journey to rebuild trust had only just begun. The flag outside the window still flew, and in the darkness it caught the light, like a quiet reminder that justice does not live in a courtroom, but in how people choose to see themselves after every fall. As Donna stepped off the courthouse steps, the crowd of reporters kept close, the sound of cameras and questions echoing through the open square. Everyone wanted her to say something to bring closure to the case that had split the nation for months. A young reporter pushed forward, microphone trembling in hand, and asked, "Do you feel victorious?" Colonel Cole, Dana, paused, turned, her face fully visible in the sunlight. Her voice was low, steady, unhurried. "I see justice breathing again." The short reply brought silence to the space around her. All chatter, all unspoken questions fell away. She said nothing more, just nodded slightly and walked on, leaving behind hundreds of lenses still following her steps. That afternoon, her words appeared on every news broadcast. The line, "I see justice breathing again," scrolled across the screen alongside an image of Dana looking up at the flag waving in the wind. A veteran journalist said on CNN, "That was not the statement of a victor, but the affirmation of someone who carried the nation's faith alone." In major newsrooms, editors paused mid-shift to discuss the power of those 6 words. They were not rallying cries, but strong enough to still a room. That night, the New York Herald printed a special edition. On the front page was a photo of Dana descending the courthouse steps with the headline in bold, "I see justice breathing again." All across America, people saw that image, a woman standing tall in the ruins of prejudice, and through her calm making justice visible and alive. On social media, her words were shared millions of times. Many said they have felt hope return. One teacher wrote, "I taped that quote to my board so my students remember justice is not abstract, it lives in every action. Another wrote, she didn't need to shout because the whole country spoke for her. Dana's image spread from mainstream media to personal timelines, from political forums to mothers' groups to veterans to those who had once stayed silent in the face of injustice. Someone wrote, when she said justice was breathing again, she reminded us we had let it suffocate for far too long. The next morning, in front of the New York Herald headquarters, dozens gathered to take photos with the large print edition of the paper. A college student told a reporter, that sentence made me realize why truth matters more than victory. Dana's story had moved beyond a single case, becoming a lesson in steadfastness. At a legal conference in Chicago, the host opened with that quote, saying it will be remembered in history as the line that awakened the system. In Washington, schools hung posters with the phrase beneath the flag. In New York, a sculptor began work on a bronze statue engraving the words in marble, I see justice breathing again. At night, Dana sat in her small apartment watching the city lights reflect off glass towers. Her phone buzzed nonstop, friends, colleagues, strangers sending thanks. She read each message, then turned off the screen. Outside the window, wind moved through the streets carrying the hush of a city just wakened from a long daze. She smiled slightly, not out of pride, but because she knew every silence she once endured had meaning. Justice does not defeat anyone. It only returns to life when someone dares to remind others that it still exists. In that moment, the words Dana had spoken in court were no longer a statement, but the living breath of a nation learning to honor the values it once promised to protect. 2 weeks after the sentencing, Colonel Dana Cole was invited to a closed-door meeting at the Pentagon. The hallway glowed cold under the lights, its walls lined with emblems of military branches, her footsteps steady against the marble floor. Inside the meeting room, the atmosphere was heavy with solemnity. The Secretary of Defense and top-ranking generals were already seated around the table, folders thick with documents from a case that had ended but still echoed across the country. When Dana entered, every eye turned toward her. The secretary, who had followed the entire investigation, spoke first, his voice low, and measured. Colonel Cole, you've done what many never dared. But now I want to ask, what do you want from all this? The question broke the silence, not with suspicion, but as an invitation to chart a path forward. Donna sat down, took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the faces, waiting for her answer. She spoke clearly, without glancing at any notes. I don't want recognition or praise. I want a mandatory training program for all law enforcement nationwide called Respect Before Power. The room fell even quieter. One general asked, how would you define that training? Dana replied, it's not a class on tactics, it's a class on how people treat each other, on understanding that a badge doesn't place someone above others, it places responsibility on them. If we can teach soldiers to respect even enemies on the battlefield, then we can teach officers to respect citizens in their own homeland. The secretary leaned on the table, his eyes reflecting thought. You know, this request will face pushback. Law enforcement is a separate system. It's not under our command. Dana nodded. I understand, but change begins with a proposal. We can offer a model materials and technical support. If the military can share its principles of discipline, dignity, and service, those same principles can help restore the integrity of law enforcement. A female general beside her added, Respect before power. That's a powerful name. It reminds us that respect must always come before authority. The room nodded in agreement. The meeting lasted through the morning. Specialists took detailed notes on the plan, from the training content and structure to the coordination mechanisms between the Department of Defense and the Department of Justice. When the meeting ended, the secretary approached Dana and shook her hand. You've planted a big seed. If it grows, America will change. Dana replied softly, I don't want it named after me. I want it to exist so no one has to go through what I did. He nodded, his his aged eyes, carrying a rare expression of deep respect. That afternoon, an official memorandum was sent to the White House titled Respect Before Power Project. The news spread quickly, and though debates continued, most of the public approved. On television, an anchor said one woman turned humiliation into a national education program. Out there, police academies began discussing, and military schools sent open letters pledging support. Dana stood by her office window, watching the shadow of the flag stretch across the courtyard. She knew the road ahead would be full of obstacles, but at least one door had opened. And in that quiet moment, as the American flag moved gently in the wind, she understood that justice doesn't end with a sentence. It begins with lessons rewritten through courage and true respect. The Secretary of Defense sat silent for a moment, his eyes resting on the words respect before power. Dana had written on the whiteboard at the back of the room. Noonlight cut through the window, casting shadows on the faces seated around the table, all realizing this moment could mark a turning point. He set down his pen and said, voice low but firm, that idea could save lives. No one added anything but agreement spread like a wave. An old general nodded, a female security advisor pressed her lips together, a quiet smile forming at the corner. They all knew what Dana was asking for wasn't just training, but push to bring humanity back into a power structure worn thin by entitlement and habit. The secretary turned to his aide and ordered the approval documents to be prepared. His voice carried a trace of emotion. We won't wait for the next incident. Today, we lay the foundation for change. Dana looked at him, her eyes filled with emotion but steady. I hope that in a few years, when an officer looks at their badge, they'll think of respect before they think of power, she said. He nodded, replying slowly, and if that happens, you'll be the one who started it. In that moment, the room fell still. The sound of a pen signing echoed steady and weighty like the heartbeat of a nation being healed. That very afternoon, the Respect Before Power program was signed and press releases were sent to every state. Major news outlets issued alerts, live broadcasts streamed from the Pentagon, and millions watched. The words Police Training Program Respect Before Power officially approved scrolled across every national news channel. One anchor said, for the first time in history, an initiative born from one individual was approved in a single day. On social media, the image of Dana shaking hands with the Secretary of Defense went viral, captioned with just one line, she made them listen. Police academies across the United States were immediately sent preliminary guidelines focusing on psychology, public service ethics, and real-life scenarios where those in uniform must face differences. An education advisor noted if this program succeeds, it could redefine the relationship between power and dignity. Outside, people gathered in front of the Pentagon, holding signs with the slogan, Respect Before Power. But this time it was no longer a protest. It was support. They clapped, sang the national anthem, and many said they felt trust had returned. That evening, news broadcasts showed Dana standing at a small podium with the American flag and the Department of Defense emblem behind her. She spoke briefly. This is not my personal victory, but the revival of justice. The room erupted in applause, and amid that applause, the secretary turned to his aides and said quietly, sometimes one strong idea can change how an entire generation treats one another. That line was recorded in the meeting minutes, but later it was quoted in many official speeches as a reminder power can be taught in training, but respect must be awakened from within. From that day on, Respect Before Power was no longer just a slogan. It became the first commitment written into the curriculum of every police academy in America. 1 month after the Respect Before Power program was approved, the first changes began to ripple across the United States. Police departments from New York, Chicago to Houston simultaneously launched mandatory training. At entrances of law enforcement buildings, posters bearing the phrase Respect Before Power were hung as a quiet yet weighty reminder. In each session, officers were required to re-watch footage from the incident involving Colonel Dana Cole, now, not to relive mistakes, but to face the lesson. At first, the atmosphere in training rooms was stiff. Many remained silent, heads lowered, but gradually the conversation began. A young officer in California said during a discussion, "I used to think respect was a feeling. Now I understand it is discipline." At the Federal Police Academy in Quantico, the program became a formal part of the new curriculum. Instructors, instead of solely teaching law, began to share real stories of decisions tainted by bias of fearful eyes they once overlooked. At the end of each class, Dana's words were read aloud. "Respect is a duty, not a reward." That sentence slowly turned into a slogan printed on coffee mugs, t-shirts, and nameplates in offices. Media outlets reported frequently on this shift, calling it the Cole effect, likening it to past moments when individuals awakened entire systems through personal action. Thank you letters started arriving at the Department of Defense and directly to Dana's office. One person wrote simply, "I used to think I was innocent for not getting involved. Now I know silence in the face of injustice is complicity." A police officer in Georgia wrote, "I apologize to a man I once wrongly accused. Thank you for teaching me how to do the right thing, not just the easy thing." Each letter was its own story, a small awakening in countless people once shaped by invisible prejudice. Dana read each line not seeking praise, but seeing her vision slowly take form. Change from within, not through force, but through awareness. At a national police conference held in Denver, the Secretary of Defense referred to the program as the starting point of a more humane generation of law enforcement. Young officers stood and shared their experiences. One said, voice trembling, "I realized power doesn't make me more respected. It makes me need to respect more." The quote was published in the Washington Post under the headline, "Lessons from Respect Before Power." On news broadcasts, anchors read excerpts from a thank you letter written by an officer. "I used to think silence was safe. Now I see it is more dangerous than mistakes." That sentence sparked nationwide discussion because it reflected a truth many had known but long avoided admitting. In her office in Arlington, Dana looked at the digital board displaying a list of academies that had completed the first phase of the program. Each line was a small milestone in the long journey she had started. The afternoon light streamed through the window, casting a glow on the badge resting on her desk. She smiled softly, not out of pride, but because she saw justice truly living in the people she once doubted. Out there, thousands of officers were training with a single lesson, learning to put humanity before power, and that alone had led a nation to begin breathing in rhythm with two seemingly simple words, respect. Afternoons at her Arlington office had slowly become the quietest moments of Colonel Dana Cole's day. On her desk, white envelopes were stacked in neat piles, each letter from a stranger, a police officer, a citizen, or sometimes a student. She sat silently, opening them one by one, reading handwritten words, some clumsy, some brief, a single sentence. "Thank you for making me think again." Others filled an entire page recounting sleepless nights, the shame of realizing they once stayed silent in the face of wrongdoing. Dana read slowly, lips pressed gently, eyes reflecting a quiet emotion. For her, this was the real victory. Not a certificate, not a title or a TV segment, but seeing individuals waking up on their own. One morning, she received a letter from an officer in the South who once acted harshly toward a teenager just because of an old car. He wrote, "I apologize to that boy. I realized we don't just enforce the law, we teach people to believe in it. You helped me see that respect isn't instinct, it's a choice we have to practice every day." She laid the letter on her desk, closed her eyes for a few seconds, feeling the full weight of those simple words. Each line was a small stone paving back the road the system had lost. Somewhere else in the country, a new police class finished their first session in the Respect Before Power program, and the instructor read her words aloud, "Respect is a duty, not a reward." The students stood and clapped, and in that moment her name became a living reminder in their minds. The media kept covering the wave of change, and among countless bold headlines, one national paper chose the simplest words, the one who made the system face itself. That line spread across news platforms, seen as the clearest summary of Dana's journey. Commentators called her the woman who redefined modern justice, while academics held conferences to study the Cole effect, a shift born from conviction, not authority. When asked about the title, she simply replied, "I didn't change the system, I just made it look in the mirror." That line was quoted again, printed in bold on the editorial page of The Atlantic, as a fitting close to her quiet but profound journey. Late at night, Dana turned off her office light and stepped onto the balcony where city lights reflected on the glass. She knew recognition would fade, but what remained were the people who chose to face the truth. Below, the wind passed over a large billboard bearing the words "Respect before power," the glowing text cutting through the night as a reminder that justice doesn't come from verdicts, but from the moment people learn to reflect, something she had started with one sentence and carried through with a lifetime of resolve. One morning in May, sunlight streamed through the office window of Colonel Dana Cole, reflecting off unfinished stacks of documents. The phone on her desk rang unexpectedly, the screen displaying "Private Line," the White House. She paused for a few seconds, then picked up. The voice on the other end was warm and steady. "Colonel Cole, this is the President. I wanted to tell you this. You've done something even Congress must respect." The room suddenly felt still. Even the wind outside seemed to pause. Dana replied calmly, though a quiet tide of emotion stirred within her. "Sir, I don't want to be respected. I just want justice to be heard without needing a title." There was a short silence. Then the President's voice returned, low but firm. "You've just said what the entire system needs to remember." He shared that since the launch of the Respect Before Power program, reports sent to the White House showed clear progress. Citizen complaints had dropped significantly, and conflict rates between officers and civilians were at their lowest in years. "You haven't just changed a profession," he said. "You've reminded the country that respect is the foundation of strength." Dana listened, her eyes fixed on the large window where the American flag rippled in the morning sun. Each word took her back through the journey, from that morning at the Jefferson intersection where she was humiliated to this office where justice was finally named with quiet resolve. She knew the path had never been bright, carved through silence, struggle, and endurance. The President continued, "We'd like to invite you to serve as an honorary advisor to the National Council on Law Enforcement Reform." The words stunned her, not because of the honor, but because of what it meant. "I can't stay there forever," she answered gently, "but I'll help if it means justice gets heard." He chuckled softly. "That's exactly why I called." "You never chased recognition." They spoke for a few more minutes about education plans, about the new generation of officers, relearning the simple truth that respect doesn't come from a badge, but from how we treat each other. Before ending the call, he said, "Thank you, Colonel. Maybe today America has learned a new way to be strong." After the call, Dana sat still for a long time. Morning light spilled across her desk, hidden her old military badge cast in a narrow glint of light. She rested her hand on it gently, tracing the metal, a faint smile passing like wind. She didn't feel victorious, just relieved that justice now had a voice, and that voice no longer carried only her name. In that silence, the phone rang again, this time from a news network inviting her to speak. She looked outside, sunlight dancing on the Potomac River, the ripples shimmering like the breath of freedom. She thought of the President's words and quietly repeated them to herself. Justice doesn't need a title to be heard. And as the light settled into the room, it felt brighter, as if justice itself was finally breathing not through slogans, but through the actions that had begun to change a nation. The President's voice on the line grew lower, carrying the solemn weight of a decision that would shape the nation. He spoke slowly, each word word deliberate. I'm going to sign an order making your slogan a national policy. The small room where Colonel Dana Cole sat fell into stillness. She gripped the receiver, not from emotion, but from the weight of what was about to happen. An idea, once written with a marker on a board, would now become federal policy, a promise that respect would be taught before power was granted. She took a deep breath and answered softly, "If that helps people listen to one another more, then that's the real victory." On the other end, the president smiled, his voice warm. "You reminded this country that strength begins with compassion." The call ended, leaving behind a long moment of silence. Dana set the phone down, her mind still echoing with his words. She leaned back in her chair as morning light slipped through the blinds, falling across her wooden desk, where the respect before power documents remained open. Between the papers lay something small but precious, a neatly folded American military flag with a soft gold trim always kept there as a reminder of where she came from. The light hit the flag, casting a faint reflection on the wall like a breath. She watched it quietly, a sense of calm and meaning rising within her as if years of service and struggle had finally found their purpose. Outside the window, Washington was waking. Car horns, early footsteps, and distant church bells blended into the city's morning rhythm. On electronic news boards, the first headline rolled out, "President to sign nationwide respect before power policy." The banner scrolled across screens below it, a photo of Dana from a past press briefing, her face calm, her eyes steady with belief. On local stations, reporters called it a turning point in American law enforcement culture. Across the country, citizens gathered outside police stations not to protest, but to hang banners in support. One older man told a reporter, "She made me believe that a uniform can still teach the world humility." Inside, Dana remained still. The shifting light fell across a photo of her father, a veteran who once told her, "Strength without respect is a threat." She remembered that first morning at the Jefferson intersection when the look in a police officer's eyes sparked a journey she never imagined. From the shame of that day to today's call, everything had come full circle. She reached out and adjusted the small flag on her desk as sunlight filtered through the window, landing on her face with a glow that was both soft and firm. In that moment, she understood that justice had moved beyond the courtroom. It had become a new promise for a country that had too often forgotten the simplest truth, respect. And as the light of morning filled the room, Dana smiled, the quiet smile of someone who knew she had just witnessed a true beginning for the next generation. When the respect before power policy was announced nationwide, Colonel Dana Cole's office in Arlington began receiving more letters than any other law enforcement agency. White, yellow, even pale blue envelopes arrived from every state, from the sunny suburbs of California to the freezing towns of Maine. A separate team was created just to sort them, but Dana insisted on keeping every single one. She said, "I want to read every letter because this is the true breath of the nation." Every evening after work, she sat by the window desk lamp, glowing over the growing stacks of mail, carefully opening each envelope. The first lines always made her pause because they weren't addressed to a colonel or a hero, but to a woman who had made them believe that respect could change the world. A retired soldier wrote, "Thank you for teaching us how to stand tall without having to shout." A single mother wrote, "Thank you for showing my daughter that dignity can triumph over humiliation." The handwriting often trembled, ink blurred by tears, but each word carried real hope. Among the thousands of letters, one stood out to Dana. A small envelope from New Orleans written in the rounded letters of a young student. "My name is Malik. I'm 12. I saw you on TV, and I want to be like you. Someone who tells the truth even when everyone is scared." She paused for a long time, rereading the line, her fingers gently brushing the paper. A quiet smile appeared, not from pride, but from recognition. She saw in those words a reflection of her younger self. A girl entering the military, believing that courage wasn't in weapons, but in standing standing up for what's right. Dana carefully folded the letter and placed it in a small glass frame on her desk next to the military badge, faded with time. She knew letters like that were the real legacy, something that would outlast any policy. One morning, a reporter asked how she felt receiving support from millions of citizens. Dana answered simply, "Each letter is a piece of a puzzle, and when they come together, I see the America I believe in." The response was aired on television and moved many viewers. In schools, teachers read Malik's letter aloud, telling the story of the woman who taught an entire country how to treat each other with respect. In the military, new recruits were encouraged to write home after completing the new ethics training, many of them quoting Dana's words as a promise to themselves. At her home, Donna dedicated a small room to store in every letter. She called it the silence room, a place where every line spoke in its own way. Letters filled the shelves, the scent of old paper mixing with wood, and every time she read them, she felt the heartbeat of the nation in each simple sentence. Some came from people once wrongfully arrested, some from young officers just out of training, some from a little white girl who wrote, "Now I know skin doesn't decide kindness." The words made Dana's eyes well up, but her smile never faded. She understood that the most powerful thing she had done was not earning praise, but helping others find their own voice, something many had once been afraid to do. And in that room full of voices, Dana whispered to herself, "Thank you, because justice is finally being written in ink." Dana read Malik's letter again and again, her eyes stopping at the last line. "I want to be like you." The innocence of that line made her heart ache, both warm and quietly pained. She took paper and pen and began her reply. Her handwriting was soft, steady, and firm. "Thank you, Malik," she wrote, "but don't become like me. Become someone who makes justice unafraid." She paused, watching the ink dry her gaze, distant. It wasn't just a note to a child, but a message to the future, to those who would live in a country where justice no longer trembled before power. She folded the letter, carefully sealed it, and walked it herself to the nearby post office. When the clerk asked if she wanted to mark it urgent, she smiled and said, "No need. This message will find its way." 3 days later, her letter appeared on social media, posted by Malik's mother with the caption, "My boy just received a letter from the woman who changed a nation." Photo of the handwritten note with the line, "Become someone who makes justice unafraid," bolded, spread rapidly. Within 24 hours, millions of shares, hundreds of thousands of comments, and countless articles debated the meaning of the words. Major outlets like the Washington Post, New York Times, and BBC reprinted the letter, calling it the nation's handwritten message. A political commentator said on live TV, "Never has one sentence made an entire society pause to think about justice like this one." In schools, teachers read the letter aloud during class meetings, and many students stood up to discuss what the word afraid meant. One student said, "If justice is afraid, who will protect us?" That question was quoted on the evening news as if the whole country was suddenly in dialogue about trust. In police academies, Dana's sentence was printed on the same wall where respect before power once hung. Now, the two messages stood side by side, one born from pain, the other from hope. Young officers were asked to copy Dana's words into their training journals. One recruit shared on TV, "She helped us see that justice is not an object, it's a feeling, and if it's scared, society will shake with it." International media called the letter the handwritten manifesto of the century. Foreign leaders quoted it in speeches about human rights. A prestigious university in England invited Dana to give a lecture, calling her the woman who turned ethics into policy. But Dana declined. She told her assistant, "I don't want it to become a lecture. It should stay with the people who need to hear it most." That sentence was later quoted in many books on leadership and social justice as proof of the power of humility. That night, while the city slept, Dana sat by the window, her phone glowing with hundreds of thank you messages. She turned it off and looked up at the night sky. In the dim light of the street lamp, she whispered to herself, "If a child can understand that, then the future is is safe. Somewhere out there, the letter she wrote by hand kept moving across screens, classrooms, and homes, becoming part of a collective memory. A reminder that justice is only truly strong when it no longer fears anyone. Dim light filtered through the bars, casting shadows on Ryan Mercer's gaunt face. In the damp cell, the small TV in the corner played the evening news. On screen was the launch ceremony for the Respect Before Power program, with hundreds of officers raising their hands in oath. The anchor's voice was steady. The new policy, signed by the president, was inspired by the story of Colonel Donna Cole. Mercer leaned back against the wall, eyes heavy. On screen, the woman he once humiliated on the street stood calm and firm in a Pentagon hall, the American flag billowing behind her. He stared at her, lips pressed tight, saying nothing. Around him, murmurs stirred among the other inmates, some recognizing the broadcast whispering, "That's the one he disrespected." Mercer clenched his fists, gaze locked on the screen as if facing his own past. A tall, raspy-voiced inmate on the lower bunk spoke up. "Hey, Mercer, think the colonel forgives you?" The question hung in the thick air, half joke, half cutting. Mercer didn't turn around. He just watched the screen where the subtitle read, "Respect Before Power, a project to awaken humanity within authority." His voice was low, cracked like sand through stone. "She doesn't need to forgive me. I'll carry the rest." Silence followed. An older man with silver hair gave a short laugh. "At least she taught you something." Mercer bowed his head, a faint smile touching his lips. Not bitter, more like the quiet acceptance of someone who finally understood what he had broken. As the news shifted to an interview, Dana appeared, speaking about the values behind the program. "You can't teach respect with a gun or a bat. You teach it with the truth." Mercer stared, something unreadable in his eyes. Regret, maybe relief. He remembered that day, the sunny morning on Jefferson, when he had approached a luxury SUV, convinced of his right to humiliate. Now, in this cold, square room, he knew that arrogance had imprisoned him long before any sentence was handed down. A nearby inmate scrubbing the floor glanced over. "You know, they say she changed the whole country." Mercer nodded slightly, whispering, "Yeah, she changed me too." When the lights went out, he still didn't sleep. On the small table beside his bed, someone had left an old newspaper, its front page showing Dana standing next to the president during the national signing. Below the photo, the headline read, "Justice Should Not Fear." Mercer touched the words gently with one finger, exhaling slowly. In the faint hallway glow, his face softened, no longer held in the tension of someone always bracing. He folded the paper, slid it under his pillow, and closed his eyes. The distant clang of a steel door echoed through the cell block, blending with the hum of the old fan overhead. For the first time in many months, Mercer felt his mind begin to quiet. He no longer saw the woman he once humiliated, but a person who emerged from his own mistakes, strong but never cruel. In a place that seemed to hold only darkness, he realized the lesson he should have learned long ago. Power can make people afraid, but only respect can set them free. The noise in the cell began to fade, leaving only the low hum of the TV replaying footage of the first police training under the name Respect Before Power. Young officers listened intently to Colonel Dana Cole's speech, while Mercer sat alone in the corner, eyes fixed on each frame like a man punished by his own awakening. A nearby inmate joked, "So she forgave you, huh?" Mercer kept his gaze on the screen, voice barely audible. "She didn't need to forgive. She won by changing the whole system." The words came out like a breath, but carried a weight that quieted those around him. He said no more, slowly, pulling the newspaper from under his pillow, smoothing the front page where she stood among the flags, her eyes calm and unwavering. His face was marked by late understanding, the deep lines on his forehead tracing the past he could no longer erase. In that moment, Mercer understood his failure wasn't the 2 years 3-year sentence, but the belief that power was a weapon. He remembered the moment he mocked her in the street, thinking a few shouts could make her submit. Now that image made him wish he could go back in time and slap himself. On the screen, Dana spoke to the young officer. Respect is the starting point, not the reward. The words pierced the last layer of denial in his mind. Mercer bowed his head, fingers digging into his palms, but he no longer felt pain. The real pain was knowing he had lost the chance to be better, just to prove he was stronger. When the broadcast ended, the TV went dark, leaving only his reflection on the screen. Mercer stared at it for a long time, seeing not the proud officer who once walked the streets with arrogance, but a tired, outdated man, as if a part of him had already died. Outside, the facility's buzzer rang, and inmates began rising for roll call. Mercer stayed seated, eyes drifting toward the light streaks on the floor cast from the hallway. A guard passed by, glanced at him, and asked, "You all right?" Mercer answered without looking up, "I'm learning how to listen." At night, the sound of an old fan blew through the hallway, blending with the soft rain falling outside the yard. Mercer lay on his bed, eyes open, staring at the cracked ceiling. He thought about what he had just said. She won by changing the whole system, and realized it wasn't regret, but acknowledgement. Inside the narrow cell, he felt the kind of freedom he had never known before. Freedom from pride, from the illusion of power. She didn't need revenge, yet she made him pay with awareness. He closed his eyes, gently exhaled. In a restless sleep, he dreamed of standing in the street again, no longer in uniform, but among a crowd bowing their heads, learning the first lesson of respect before power. And for the first time in many years, Mercer felt peace, because he finally understood her victory did not come from power, but from the awakening of people like him. 2 years had passed since Mercer's sentence ended, and America had changed quietly but profoundly. The Respect Before Power program was no longer a pilot initiative, but a national standard mandatory in every police academy and law enforcement agency. In every state, from New York to Texas, from small towns along the Mississippi River to downtown Los Angeles, the slogan was carved into training room walls: Respect Before Power. It became the first oath taken by every new officer before putting on the uniform. News outlets called it a revolution in silence, a transformation not driven by protest or harsh mandates, but by education and awareness. At the center of that change, Colonel Dana Cole still kept her simple habit of teaching weekly at the Federal Police Academy, where she believed the future of justice was being shaped one day at a time. That morning, the classroom was fuller than usual. Hundreds of cadets sat upright in dark blue uniforms, eyes fixed on the podium. Dana walked in, needing no introduction, and the room fell completely silent. She set down her notes and spoke in a steady, clear voice. "Power is not for proving, it is for protecting." The words landed in the soft light, falling on each person like a moral command. She walked slowly along the rows, eyes scanning the young faces. "When you put on this uniform, do not think people will obey out of fear. They should trust you because they feel respected. If you make someone bow their head in fear, you've betrayed your oath." The room stayed quiet, save for the sound of pens moving. One cadet raised a hand and asked, "Ma'am, what if people insult the police?" Dana paused her gaze, calm but firm. "Then you must act like someone worthy of the badge you wear." The room rose in applause, not from routine, but out of respect. After class, many stayed behind to take photos with her. One young cadet said sincerely, "We've been taught the law, but today we learned dignity." Dana smiled, her eyes catching the sunlight through the window. "If one day you no longer need me to remind you of that, the program will have fulfilled its mission." The photo taken that day was later hung with honor in the Academy hallway under the caption, "Legacy of a Woman, Respect Before Power." The press wrote that no one had changed the culture of law enforcement this deeply since the 1960s. Dana's lectures were compiled into official teaching material, translated into 8 languages and used in international training programs. She declined every honorary award, saying only, "I don't want credit. I want to be replaced by people who do it better." That statement spread, becoming the opening line for every training session. At the first graduation after the program's nationwide adoption, thousands of new officers recited her words in unison. Power is not for proving, it is for protecting. Their voices rose across the courtyard, echoing past the flagpole, blending with the wind. In a quiet corner of the stands, Dana stood still, a slow smile on her face. She knew that from this moment forward, justice could finally stand on its own, needing no one to defend it anymore. The auditorium held its breath as Colonel Dana Cole paused at the center of the podium, her hand resting lightly on the textbook. She looked around, eyes landing on each young face before her, then spoke slowly. "The strongest person is the one who understands another's pain." The words echoed, not loud, not emphasized, but carried through the room quiet and deep. A stillness swept over the space, then something seemed to break open in the air as the entire hall rose in a wave of applause. The clapping was not noisy, but steady and certain, like an agreement from hundreds of young hearts. A student in the front row bowed her head, tears falling before she could wipe them because she felt she had just heard something simple enough to change the way she lived. Dinah smiled the smile of someone who knew what it meant to be hurt, but also how to rise without losing her humanity. Her voice softened. "You will face moments when reason and emotion collide, and in those moments, remember this: the one who understands pain knows how to stop violence." A young man near the window raised his hand, voice shaky. "Ma'am, are you ever afraid that justice might be distorted again?" Dana looked at him, eyes steady. "Justice can be wounded, but it cannot be killed, as long as someone is brave enough to face what went wrong." The room fell silent again. Then the applause returned slow and resounding like waves. After the lecture, students filled the hallway, their voices mixing with the sound of them repeating her words. A young woman quickly jotted the quote into her notebook and said to her friend, "I think this will stay with me forever." At the far end of the hallway, a group of senior instructors watched through the glass, all nodding. One of them whispered, "She teaches the law with her heart." The next day, the Washington Chronicle published a speech under the headline, "The strongest person is the one who understands another's pain," calling it the most impactful lecture in American police training history. News channels replayed the clip of her speaking, the woman in uniform, standing before hundreds of cadets, voice calm, gaze full of empathy. The anchor commented, "Maybe America has never needed someone like her more than now." The message spread, and in many cities, people began quoting her words in education programs, public signage, and even on police station walls. In Chicago, a high school placed the quote at its entrance beneath the American flag with a small caption, "Quote by Colonel Dana Cole." The words moved beyond a classroom lesson, becoming a living reminder for the whole society. In human rights conferences, scholars referred to it as the modern definition of compassion in power. Dana gave no more speeches, stayed away from the media, and continued her regular lectures, wanting only to see real change in the eyes of each young person. One afternoon, as she left the academy, sunlight passed through the glass walls, casting a glow on the faded words, "Respect before power." She stopped, read each word again, then smiled softly. A student ran after her, holding out a piece of paper. "I'd like your signature as a keepsake." On the paper, he had already written her quote. Dana signed beneath the words, looked at him, and said gently but firmly, "Keep this until you understand it, not just remember it." The cadet nodded, gripping the paper as if holding on to a promise. That evening, the national news replayed footage from the class, mixed with old clips of her testifying before Congress. A commentator said, "If one person can teach a whole generation how to listen, that is the greatest victory." In her small apartment, Dana sat alone by the window, the city lights reflecting off the glass. She didn't watch the news, only listened to the sounds drifting in from the street, cars, voices, laughter. All of it formed the rhythm of a life she had helped make a little kinder. She poured a cup of teas on the night, her heart at ease. In that silence, she understood her legacy wasn't written in books or laws, but in people who could see another's pain and still choose to stand tall. And as the night wind stirred the curtain, it felt like the whole city whispered back that same line. The strongest person is the one who understands another's pain. That summer morning, the Washington sky was unusually clear, the clouds seeming to pause and witness a moment of history. On the plaza, in front of the Pentagon, thousands gathered early, carrying small flags, signs, and placards with the words, "Respect before power." As Colonel Dana Cole stepped onto the platform, a light breeze swept through the American flag, flapping boldly, sunlight flashing off the silver insignia on her chest like a memory being brought to light. Camera shutters clicked rapidly, but Dana stood still, raising her hand in the salute. Face, calm eyes fixed on the flag blazing in the sun. In that moment, the crowd fell silent, as if waiting for something beyond ceremony, a quiet confirmation that justice had found new form in the heart of the nation. Below the platform, thousands of voices rose together, merging into a deep, steady chant. Respect before power. Respect before power. The chant was not loud or rushed, but firm, grounded, like an oath taken by an entire generation. Dana looked out and saw faces, young and old, officers in uniform, standing beside civilians, no longer divided by power, only joined by resolve. She took a breath, her voice ringing clear through the microphone. 2 years ago, I stood at an intersection where justice was insulted. Today, I stand in a square where justice is being sung. Cheers broke out, and the flag atop the tallest pole snapped in the wind, sunlight flaring off the silver badge like a flame. She continued, her voice slower now. We have passed through pain, through mistakes, through silence. And today, we prove that respect is not a privilege, but a shared responsibility of every citizen. A group of young cadets raised their hands in salute, answering in unison. Yes, ma'am. The response echoed across the open space, bringing a quiet smile to Dana's face. She looked up at the American flag waving above the red, white, and blue, glowing in the midday light like a symbol of renewed belief. Below, television cameras captured her every move, preserving the image of the woman who had turned an act of humiliation into a national reform. The Secretary of Defense stepped forward, presenting her with the Medal of Honor, a symbol of contributions beyond the battlefield. He said softly, "You didn't just serve in war, you served in peace." Dana nodded, a soft light in her eyes. She didn't reply, only looked toward the crowd where people held signs bearing the words she once wrote to young Malik Bissau, someone who makes justice unafraid. Under the sunlight, those words shimmered like an oath carved in light. The ceremony ended, but no one left. As she stepped down from the platform, the chant rose again, louder, deeper, as if the sound was spreading across the sky. Respect before power. A reminder, a tribute, a vow from an entire generation. Dana paused, turned, and raised her hand in one final salute, her eyes meeting the top of the flagpole where light had gathered, glowing like a reply to all the years of struggle. She knew that from this day on, even if her name faded, the words respect and justice had merged, living in the hearts of millions. As she crossed the line between the stage and the crowd, a beam of sunlight caught the silver badge on her chest, reflecting onto the ground like an eternal flame. The flame of belief that power only has meaning when it bows to human dignity. The moment the flag flew high above the platform marked the closing of Colonel Dana Cole's journey in a perfect circle. From the humiliation of a morning on Jefferson Street to the honor restored in the brilliant light of justice, everything seemed to slow as she looked up at the American flag waving above, red and white stripes casting their colors onto her face, both peaceful and proud. Amid the echoing chant of respect before, power below, Donna felt clearly that this was no longer a personal victory, but the rebirth of a value once buried. Every word she had spoken, every look she had endured, every painful silence, now crystallized into a living symbol. She knew there was no need to speak further, for every word had been replaced by the image of a woman standing tall in the storm, calm and unbroken. As the crowd began to disperse, many remained. The applause continued uncoordinated and unprompted, like the voice of a nation that had learned its lesson through pain. A reporter near the barrier caught her final words. Justice doesn't need to shout. It just needs to stand tall in the storm. The line spread like fire, aired in the evening news, printed in the next day's papers, and soon engraved on the walls of schools and public institutions. People spoke of Dana Cole not as a symbol of military strength, but of calm rising above injustice. Her story wasn't about triumph, but about how one holds on to dignity when everything else falls apart. After the ceremony, Dana quietly stepped away from the crowd, descending the steps as cheers faded into the wind. She passed by rows of people saluting, not stopping, only offering a small smile as she walked on posture, straight, slow, but steady. A child ran up, handing her a small flag, eyes clear. "You're my hero," he said. Donna knelt, placed a hand on his shoulder, and replied gently, "No, you're the hero because you were born into a world where justice can be trusted again." The boy didn't fully understand, but he smiled and raised the flag high. The photo of that moment became the year's most iconic image, a symbol of a new generation raised on belief in human dignity. On television, commentators said Dana Cole proved that real change doesn't come from power or rage, but from unwavering kindness and steady resolve in the face of injustice. International magazines ran her image on the cover, calling her the woman who taught justice how to stand. But in her small apartment, Dana didn't watch the news. She hung up her uniform, removed the silver badge, and placed it next to her father's photo, the man who once told her that true strength isn't in the hand, but in how one holds on to compassion amid cruelty. She turned on the light, looked out the window, and saw the city glowing across streets where stories like hers had already begun to change. Months later, universities invited her to speak, but Dana accepted only one, the high school where Malik studied. When she walked in, students stood and clapped, and Malik, now a teenager, ran up and hugged her. On the blackboard, the teacher had written her quote in white chalk, "Justice doesn't need to shout, it just needs to stand tall in the storm." The room fell silent as she shared her story, not in grand tones, but with steady, honest words that made each listener feel seen. When she finished, Malik raised his hand and asked, "Were you scared when people didn't believe you?" Donna replied, "I was, but that fear made me stand taller." The class applauded for a long time, and for years the moment was remembered as one of the school's most powerful. That night, Dana walked through the plaza, the flag still waving under the lights. She paused, looked up at the clear sky, the city's glow reflecting on the thin clouds. What she felt wasn't pride, but a rare peace, the peace of someone who had completed a mission without needing a victory parade. She whispered, almost to herself, justice found its voice. "I just helped it reach the ones who needed to hear." A breeze passed, making the flag ripple, catching light on the old badge she still carried. In that moment, between light and wind, after the chants had faded, the story of Dana Cole closed, not with celebration, but with a sacred quiet, where human dignity stood honored by the calm of someone who chose to stand tall in the storm. As the last light of day touched the Pentagon Plaza, Colonel Dana Cole still stood there, eyes on the flag waving in the wind. The chant, "Respect before power," had faded into the air, but its echo lingered like the steady heartbeat of a nation awakened. Her journey ended not with applause or praise, but with a deep silence, the kind shared by people who had witnessed something beyond one person's story, beyond the lines between victim and offender. Dana Cole's life proved that sometimes justice doesn't come from a court or a verdict, from the moment someone chooses to stand tall in the storm. It all began on what seemed like an ordinary morning when her SUV was stopped at the Jefferson intersection. Officer Ryan Mercer, through a lens of prejudice, turned a routine traffic stop into a public humiliation. The words "you're driving above your place for your skin color" became the spark for a chain of events he could never have foreseen. When Mercer dumped her purse onto the hood, mocked her military badge and real ID, Dana didn't argue or plead. She simply picked up her phone and said calmly, "This is Cole. I'm being unlawfully stopped by the police. Send my location to the Department of Defense." And then, when she said the words, the Pentagon Mercer's entire world collapsed. What seemed like a statement of identity became a symbol of reversed power. The moment a black woman dismissed as insignificant made the system bow its head. From the footage recorded at the scene, outrage erupted. America is split between those angry over racial injustice and those still defending Mercer. But in the eye of the storm, Dana didn't seek cameras, didn't give interviews, didn't speak in anger. She stayed silent, letting her actions speak. When asked what she wanted, she answered, "I don't need an apology, I need change." From that, the words "respect before power" began to spread, first as a quote, then a slogan, and finally a national movement. Under public pressure, the Department of Defense launched an investigation, and Mercer was suspended, then convicted for abuse of power. But that sentence was just the surface. What America truly had to face wasn't Mercer but itself, the system that let him believe skin color defined worth. When Dana appeared before the Human Rights Committee, her words silenced the room. An officer who makes disrespect a habit is a danger to all of society. It wasn't meant to condemn, but to point out that the silence of good people is the real threat. And from those words, the Respect Before Power training program was born. Dana proposed it, the department supported it, and the president signed it into action. For the first time in history, a course in ethics became a mandatory foundation for all law enforcement nationwide. Thousands of officers were retrained, millions watched her lectures, and from that point on, respect became the new language of authority. 2 years later, as the program became a national standard, Dana taught at the Federal Police Academy. Her lectures had no complex formulas or rigid theories, just one opening line: "Power is not to prove, but to protect." She told the cadets about the responsibility of wearing the uniform, that when you make someone bow out of fear, you've betrayed your oath. That line was printed in training manuals hung in every briefing room and became the guiding principle for a new generation. And when she ended the session with "the strongest person is the one who understands another's pain," the entire room rose in applause, not for ceremony, but because they knew they had just learned something no textbook could ever teach. On the other side, Mercer sat silently in the correctional facility watching the news report about the new program. When a fellow inmate asked, "Did that colonel forgive you?" he replied, "She didn't need to. She won by changing the whole system." His face carried the weight of late realization, yet also calm, because he finally understood what he once rejected. Respect doesn't make people weak. It makes society strong. In the dark of the cell, he folded the newspaper with Dana's photo, placed it under his pillow, and for the first time in his life, slept peacefully. In the years that followed, Dana declined every honorary award, refused appearances in media campaigns. She told a reporter, "I don't want to become a legend. I want people to forget me, but remember what I did." That sentence reflected her completely. Humble, clear-minded, and resolute. She spent her time teaching writing letters by hand to students and responding to mail from across America. One of them was from Malik, a 1-year-old who wrote, "I want it to be like you." Dana replied, "Don't be like me. Be someone who makes justice unafraid." That letter spread like a national message read in schools, etched on memorial stones, printed on thousands of posters. And from there, a new generation in America grew up believing that courage doesn't live in power, but in kindness. Eventually, at the national ceremony honoring the Respect Before Power program, Dana stepped onto the stage as the flag waved in the wind. She saluted the crowd below, chanting the slogan in unison. Light reflected off the silver badge, casting a glow across her face. Once called trash in the street, now a symbol of dignity and justice. When the Secretary of Defense presented her with the medal and said, "You saved thousands of lives," with one sentence, Dana simply replied, "I didn't save anyone. I just reminded people that human beings deserve respect." As she stepped down from the stage, a child ran up and handed her a small flag, saying, "You're my hero." Dana knelt and answered, "No, you're the hero, because you live in a world where justice no longer has to be afraid." Dana Cole's story didn't end on that stage, but continued in everyone who ever heard her name. From police academies to classrooms, from chambers of government to ordinary homes, people retold the journey of the woman who made the system look at itself. She didn't need to shout, didn't need revenge, didn't need to prove anything. She simply stood tall, letting the storm die down around her, and that very calmness made justice heard. The lesson Dana's story leaves behind is one every generation must remember, that power is not a shield to hide weakness, but a mirror to reflect responsibility. That respect does not begin with status or skin color, but with how one chooses to act when holding authority. And that justice does not need to shout to exist. It only needs people who dare to stand tall, even in the storm. As night fell, Donna sat by the window, looking out at the city lit in soft gold, stretched like a trail of fallen stars. She knew her life would fade into the pages of history, but the seeds she planted had already begun to grow. Somewhere, cadets were relearning the first lesson of respect before power. Somewhere, a child was writing to their hero, and somewhere, justice was breathing, not through shouting, but through the rhythm of those who bow to human dignity. In the dim light reflecting off the flag, Dana whispered to herself, "Justice doesn't need to fear. It only needs to be believed." And then she smiled, knowing that for the first time in years, America had finally started to believe again.